This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive scottishvisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour from Exclusive Scottish Visits, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the go-to podcast on all things Scottish. It gives you an overview of the whole of Scotland, its unique landscape, its people and its history, and we'll travel the length and breadth of this amazing country in my Unique Scotland series. Today I am broadcasting this from my study in Aberlady, and for those of you finding me for the first time, it's a small village about 20 minutes east of Edinburgh. For March, it's mild with temperatures around 10 degrees centigrade, and the one really noticeable thing, at the moment anyway, is the lengthening days, and it was still light around 6:30 p.m. last night. And that's great because I enjoy a nice walk around the local golf course with Minnie, our wee spaniel dog, especially when the golfers have gone in for the evening. This podcast is the second in a 4-part series on Edinburgh City, the capital of Scotland. In this series, I'm covering the Old Town and the New Town, followed by a tour of Edinburgh Castle, that massive fortification sitting atop an extinct volcano. And finally, we take a walk down the Royal Mile, the route from the top of the High Street by the castle, all the way down to Holyrood Palace, and have a look at the closes or alleyways with many stories to be told. In the last podcast on the Old Town, you heard of the appalling conditions that everyone lived in, both rich and poor. So, when a new town was built just to the north, the rich moved out. In this podcast, we'll hear what exactly the new town is, how it was built, and about some of the most famous people who lived in the new town. For example, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, and Robert Louis Stevenson, one of Scotland's most famous writers, to name but a few. I'll be explaining why a new town was needed, and why, having been built in the late 1700s, it's still called the new town today. And I'll tell you about the skeletons that were found when the Norloch, and that was the loch between the old and the new towns, was drained. Who were these unfortunates to die in a stinking cesspit? Witches, perhaps? The new town was built at the time of George III, the king who lost that little colony across the Atlantic, of course now called the United States of America. And many of the names in the new town refer to him, such as Charlotte Square, named after his wife. When visiting Edinburgh, you can also visit one of the grand Georgian mansions, still preserved as it was built in 1790, called the Georgian House. And I'm delighted to say that we will also be hearing from Shona, the manager, and Sarah, one of the volunteers, who were kind enough to be interviewed for this podcast and bring the Georgian House to life with their stories. This and so much more to come. So I think it's time to get the tour of the new town underway, and as always, it's great to share Scotland with you. Perhaps this podcast will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country for yourselves, and if you do, you will certainly be stopping in our capital city for a night or two. However, if for whatever reason you can't come in person, then let me bring Scotland to you. To see some great photos of this Newtown city tour, have a look at my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. You can look at my Facebook page or Instagram. And if you listen through my website, please don't forget to email subscribe to ensure that you get notification of future episodes. Well, wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax and be transported to the capital city of Scotland on this second part of our Unique Scotland journey around Edinburgh's new town. When you climb to the top of Edinburgh Castle, right at the top of the Old Town, and look to the north, the height gives you a superb view of the new town below. And it stands out so clearly. It's not just a jumble of more buildings emanating from the Old Town, but it's a clear rectangular shaped construct of amazing yellow sandstone Georgian architecture. Admittedly, some of the buildings closest to you have been converted to shops, but you can't mistake the extraordinary beauty of this special part of Edinburgh. So, why a new town? Well, in my last podcast, I've talked about the appalling conditions and overcrowding that existed in Edinburgh's Old Town in the 17th and 18th centuries. But there was another concern, in that the wealthy were starting to move from Edinburgh to London, taking away a huge amount of talent just as the Scottish Enlightenment was taking shape. So the decision to build a new town was based on commerce as well as overcrowding, and the fact that the wealthy were fed up with living in squalor, filth and disease. There was a competition in 1766 to design a plan for the new town, and this was won by a young architect called James Craig. He was only 26 years old at the time, and he decided to follow the natural contours of the land and, not dissimilar from the Old Town, placed the principal road along the ridge of a hill, albeit not as steep as the Old Town. And he designed a simple rectangular grid in an east-west direction, with this principal road linking two large squares. There were to be other main roads south and north of the central road, with minor streets in between. At either end of the new town, we have two squares, Charlotte Square and St Andrew's Square. The names should have been St George's Square and St Andrew's Square, after the patron saints of England and Scotland. However, there was already a St George's Square in Edinburgh, so to save confusion, that square was named after Charlotte, the king's wife. The naming of the streets was carefully planned with political significance, and for that we've got to look to the Battle of Culloden, near Inverness, between the Jacobites, or supporters of the exiled King James VII, and the British government. And that had been fought around 20 years earlier, where the Jacobites were roundly defeated and the rebellion, the Jacobite rebellion, was finally put down. Now, Edinburgh City's fathers, showing their support for the new Hanoverian King George III and his government, named the streets of the new town with some connection to the king. For example, the central road within the new town is called George Street, and the road to the north is called Queen Street, while the road to the south is called Princess Street. And that's not Princess Feminine, but Princes Masculine, after the son of George III, whose name was actually Frederick. And running at right angles to the main streets are names such as Frederick Street and Hanover Street. You also have a Thistle Street and a Rose Street, which are the emblems of Scotland and England, showing that this also acknowledged the union of the crowns, as well as the union of Great Britain. The start of the project was to extend the boundary of the old Edinburgh to the north, and as mentioned, that meant draining the heavily polluted Norloch and the building of the new town just beyond the drained loch. To connect the old and the new towns, a bridge called the North Bridge was built in 1772, and during construction, all the material excavated was placed between the two towns, and it built up to such an extent that this was turned into another access point and has become what is known locally today as the Mound, effectively an earth mound running all the way down from the old to the new towns. You will recall from my last podcast that the loch just north of the old town, called the Norloch, was where all the rubbish and human waste was dumped from the old town buildings above. This really was a stinking, putrid, disease-ridden loch, which was well overdue for draining. Now, we all know what gas is created by human and animal waste. Yes, methane gas. And in a report from 1754, it was noted that this gas would rise and circulate around the closes of the old town, causing some people to hallucinate. It makes you wonder if some of the major fires in the old town were not started by exploding methane gas. Anyway, it took another 10 years for work to start on the loch to be drained, and a further 10 years for its completion. When the loch was drained, numerous skeletons were found. Were they poor wretches murdered and thrown in by unscrupulous thugs, or perhaps they simply fell in after a good night at the local alehouse? Well, we'll never know, but it is clear that some of them must have been accused witches who, as part of a normal punishment at the time, were thrown into the loch to prove that they did or did not belong to the devil's own coven. It's dreadful to think that in the 16 and 1700s, around 300 men and women were subjected to what was called witch ducking, or witch duking in the Norloch. Now, duking is being submerged in water, and the word always takes me back to my childhood when, at Halloween, we used to duke for apples. It meant that a big bowl was filled with water and apples, and of course apples were lighter than water, so floated on the top, and you had to catch an apple in your teeth to retrieve one. Well, of course, you ended up sinking the apple to the bottom before you were able to bite into it, therefore giving your head a good duking. Such simple pleasures for Halloween in those days. Anyway, before I digress further, let's return to those men and women who were subjected to the witch ducking or witch duking. Now, these poor specimens, having been accused and found guilty of being witches or warlocks, were tied to a ducking stool with their toes and thumbs tied together. Then they were thrown into the loch. Now, if they drowned, they were clearly innocent and freed from the false accusation. Their reward was a pardon and a good Christian burial. If, however, they did not sink and drown, then they had to be under the devil's spell. So they were brought out of the loch, taken up to Castle Hill, and that's on the present-day esplanade, where they were garroted or strangled and then burned at the stake. Either way, not a good outcome for any individual accused of witchcraft. Today, at the bottom of the esplanade of the castle, there's a witch's well, an ornate water fountain which was commissioned in 1894 to commemorate the women and the men who suffered during this period. So when visiting Edinburgh, and you'll almost certainly visit the castle, pay your respects at the witch's well for those poor unfortunates who were subjected to this appalling barbarity. Moving on and back to the New Town. It was built in stages between 1767 and completed around 1820 with the building of Charlotte Square, to design by Robert Adam, one of Scotland's foremost architects of the time. This square is the only remaining architecturally unified section of the New Town and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as is the Old Town, and we'll hear later how the 4th Marquess of Bute was largely responsible for preserving Charlotte Square in its original form. So having set the scene, let's set off on our tour to the New Town, and we'll start where we left off from the Old Town tour at the bottom of the Royal Mile. From Holyrood Palace, we'll head up Abbey Hill and onto Abbey Mount before turning left towards Waterloo Road and onto Princes Street. But before we leave Waterloo Road, look up to your right-hand side and you'll see Calton Hill, one of the 7 hills of Edinburgh, with both the Waterloo Monument and the Trafalgar Monuments at the top, commemorating 2 of Britain's greatest victories during the Napoleonic Wars. On the left-hand side is Calton Cemetery, which is a must-visit if you're in this part of town. Some of the great and good of Edinburgh are buried here, including David Hume, the great philosopher. For my American friends, you may be interested to note a large monument with a standing figure of Abraham Lincoln commemorating the American Civil War and dedicated to the Scottish American soldiers who fought and died in the Civil War. An incredible monument. Just after the cemetery, we arrive onto Princes Street, and the first building on the left-hand side is the magnificent Balmoral Hotel, with its clock tower visible all over Edinburgh. And the clock itself is always running 5 minutes fast, and the reason for that is that people will not be late for the trains that leave from Waverley Station. Actually, the hotel used to be called the North British Railway Hotel, opened by the North British Railway Company next to their main station, Waverley. And the station was named after Sir Walter Scott's Waverley novels, and we can already see his extraordinary monument just ahead of us. But before that, look to the right, and the classical Greek building is Register House, designed by Robert Adam, who I've just mentioned. It was the first public building in the New Town, and was partly paid for from forfeited Jacobite estates. Oh, to be on the losing side. In front of this building is a bronze statue of Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, on his horse. Yes, this is the famous Wellington who won the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon, and, but for this man and of course his soldiers, we would probably all be speaking French today. This is also a great viewpoint, looking back at Waterloo Road towards Calton Hill, where you can see the Waterloo Monument that I've just mentioned. And this great victory actually took place at Waterloo, which is just south of Brussels in Belgium. Now, I lived in Belgium for 4 years during my time in the Royal Navy, and I went to a couple of reenactments of the battle, which happens every year. I have to say the costumes and the 19th century weapons that were on display are incredible, and you get a real sense of what it must have been like. Anyway, we continue down Princes Street, and you just can't miss the huge, black, Gothic, rocket-looking monument towering over Princes Street Gardens. This is the Scott Monument. It was constructed in 1838 in honour of one of Scotland's most famous writers, Sir Walter Scott. It's about 200 feet tall and has 287 steps and gets narrower the higher you climb. Now, it's not for the faint-hearted. Actually, it's the second highest monument to a writer in the world, with the José Martí Memorial in Cuba standing some 358 feet, and that was completed in 1958, which effectively is over 100 years since the Scott Monument was constructed. At the base of the Scott Monument, in between the 4 columns, is a beautiful Carrara marble statue of Scott, showing him seated with a quill pen and his pet dog Maida by his side. The monument also has 64 figures from characters from his novels, and if you have a head for heights, it's certainly worth the climb for the fabulous view. As we continue along Princes Street, look over to your left-hand side and you'll see Princes Street Gardens, beautiful at any time of year to walk along, allowing you to stay away from the traffic and crowds of the main thoroughfare. As I mentioned earlier, this was born from the draining and filling of the Norloch, so give those poor wretches who fell in or who were thrown in to prove a point in 17th century Scotland a thought. You will also see, hovering above the gardens high up on its volcanic crag, the magnificent Edinburgh Castle. At Princes Street level, you'll also get a glimpse of some fabulous Greek temple-looking buildings which are sitting on the mound, and these are the National Gallery and the Royal Scottish Academy, and I'll talk about them when we come back onto Princes Street, but for the time being, we're going to turn right up St David Street to come into St Andrew's Square. And the first thing that you'll notice is the enormous Melville Monument right in the middle of the square. Stands at 150 feet high and was erected in 1821 with a figure on top which represents Henry Dundas, who effectively governed Scotland on behalf of Britain's Prime Minister William Pitt. Dundas was actually nicknamed King Henry of Scotland. The other striking feature in the square is the large neoclassical house set back away from the other residences. This is Dundas House, built in 1774 for Sir Lawrence Dundas, MP for Edinburgh. He owned part of the land upon which the new town was built and decided to have his own mansion built here. According to the original plans, it should have been the site of St Andrew's Church, but power and money won the day. Now, if you believe in karma, he actually lost the house in a game of cards. Well, today the house has been taken over by the Royal Bank of Scotland and its parent NatWest Group, and you will see there are some modern buildings which have replaced the Georgian houses of the past. And that's the main difference today between St Andrew's Square and Charlotte Square at the other end of George Street, where Charlotte Square has retained all of its original dwellings, as we shall see shortly. Turning left onto George Street, immediately on the right-hand side, there's a bronze sculpture of a seated man named James Clerk Maxwell, with a wee Scottish terrier under his legs. He was a Scottish physicist and responsible for the classical theory of electromagnetic radiation. And his theories led to a prediction of the existence of radio waves. Now, if this interests you, the house that he was born is at 14 India Street, and it's been turned into a museum operated by the James Clerk Maxwell Foundation. An amazing individual, complemented by Einstein no less, and someone whose achievements have sadly gone unnoticed. Well, as we drive along George Street, on the left-hand side, we come to a fabulous Greco-Roman building with 6 Corinthian columns, topped by a pediment with figures on the top. This is the Dome and was formerly the Bank of Scotland, but is now a restaurant, bar and club. I lunched there last week and the magnificent interior matches the external look of a classic building. This is built to impress. And inside there's an exquisite glass dome in the centre of the building to give natural light to the diners in its main restaurant. There's a couple of photos on my website showing the grandeur of this building, so if you care to have a look, go to my website. Opposite the dome is the St Andrew's and St George's Church, the one which should have been built in St Andrew's Square. It was designed by Major Andrew Fraser of the Royal Engineers in 1785, and it's a round church, much like that in Bowmore on the island of Islay. They say that the round design was to make sure there were no corners for the devil to hide. The next junction we come to is Hanover Street, and in the middle of the road is a statue of King George IV. It was erected in 1831 and commemorates the visit by the King to Edinburgh in 1822 at the invitation of Sir Walter Scott. If you visit Holyrood Palace, there's a portrait of the King in a kilt which he wore for his visit, and he appears to be wearing silk stockings. This visit was also a watershed for Highlanders because since the Jacobite rebellion had been quashed, the wearing of the kilt had been banned. And during this visit, the King seemed to lift this prohibition by adorning a kilt himself. And many of the tartans that you actually see today are from that period. The next building of note on the left-hand side is the Assembly Rooms. It dates from 1787 and was built as a venue for dances, concerts and literature readings. Sir Walter Scott performed here himself, and there was a ball for the visit of King George IV. I actually visited the building only last week to attend a celebration for the Chinese New Year, and it was the Joyful Dragon for a Happy Chinese New Year evening. And it was quite an event with performances from actors, kung fu experts, an orchestra and dancers, and all flown in from Beijing. Still heading west on George Street, the next junction is Frederick Street, named after George III's son. At this junction is a statue of William Pitt the Younger, who was only 24 years old when he became Britain's Prime Minister. Not sure if I don't sense a wee bit of nepotism there. However, he was an outstanding organiser and administrator. He's known as Pitt the Younger to distinguish him from his father, William Pitt, who previously served as a Prime Minister himself. Pitt the Younger actually served under King George III and was in office during the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution, and the American War of Independence. Indeed, my American friends will be interested to hear that Pitt denounced the continuation of the war and made the case that the Prime Minister, Lord North, should make peace with the rebellious American colonists. So he was young, but he had foresight. There's a short poem about Pitt that I really like, and it reflects his youth on the world stage, and it goes thus. Above the rest, majestically great, behold the infant Atlas of the state, the matchless miracle of modern days, in whom Britannia to the world displays, a sight to make surrounding nations stare, a kingdom trusted to a schoolboy's care. I love it. A schoolboy, but a statesman nevertheless, and a fitting eulogy, I think. As we continue along George Street, we come to number 84, with a lighthouse above the door. In fact, this lighthouse is a replica of the Bell Lighthouse, designed by Robert Stevenson, who was the grandfather of Robert Louis Stevenson, the great writer. Now, Robert Stevenson headed a family of lighthouse builders, and he was the first official engineer of this organisation. This building is the headquarters of the Northern Lighthouse Board, and all lighthouses around Scotland and Northern Ireland, which are now automated by the way, are controlled from here. Continuing on, we see that there are some classy shops selling everything from jewellery to designer clothes. We pass Rohan, Hackett and the White Company, Gant, Cruise to name but a few. And as we continue along George Street, we come to number 96, and it's prominent by the large statue of St Andrew on his cross above the doorway. This is the Freemasons' Hall, the Grand Lodge of Scotland. In simple terms, Freemasonry is effectively a club of businessmen who help each other, and they model themselves on the fraternities of medieval stonemasons who would use secret words and symbols to recognise each other's work. And it's this symbolism and signs that have created the image of a secret society. But in truth, almost anyone can join, as long as you abide by the society's rules, not dissimilar to joining any club. Incredibly, Scotland's Masonic Lodge in Edinburgh has records dating from 1599. The next junction is Castle Street, and look up to your left, and you get a great view of the castle sitting high above Edinburgh. The statue in the centre is Thomas Chalmers, who was a Scottish Presbyterian minister and a leader of both the Church of Scotland and the Free Church of Scotland. Now, the Free Church of Scotland came about because of what was called non-intrusionism. Effectively, it was a group of Church of Scotland clergy who believed that no minister should be forced upon a parish against the will of the people. At that time, the minister was appointed by the state and therefore had an allegiance to the local government rather than the people he served, i.e. his congregation. And matters came to a head, and in 1843 at the St Andrews and St George's Church, which we've just passed in George Street, when 470 clergy walked out of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland and established themselves the Free Church of Scotland, with Chalmers as their leader, or the moderator as it's called. Now, this was a bold and heroic move by all those who defended the right of the people to choose who represented them in their churches, as the ministers walked away from good, paid jobs with accommodation provided. I actually have a story of how the Free Church affected me. When I was a boy, our family used to go to the Church of Scotland in Newton Grange, a small mining village about 10 miles south of Edinburgh. When we moved a few years later to the adjacent mining village of Gorebridge, I recall we went to the local Free Church of Scotland. Now, I was a boy of about 10 years old, and I recall getting a small sum of money every week to put into the church collection tray. Well, when we started going to the Free Church, I truly believed that it meant it was free to attend, so I kept the money and bought sweets, or candy. It took a few weeks for my mother to find out where I was getting the money for the sweets, and thankfully she saw the funny side of my genuine misunderstandings. So Mr. Chalmers, well done for standing by your principles of putting the people first and allowing a congregation to choose their own minister. and also thank you from me personally for some free sweets, for a few weeks anyway. In my research on Chalmers, I found this quote from him, which I think sums up the true nature of the man. And it goes like this: "Who cares about the Free Church compared with the Christian good of the people of Scotland? Who cares for any church but as an instrument of good?" Well, I think that's brilliant, and the world would be a safer place and a quieter one if everyone took heed of these eloquent words. Well, as we come to the end of George Street, it's interesting to reflect on how the houses of the past have been transformed into offices, shops and restaurants on the ground floors. For example, just before entering Charlotte Square, there are 3 superb restaurants together on the right-hand side. There's Brown's, Gusto and Leguano. Now, I've enjoyed every one of them and can recommend them on your visit. And by the way, so far I've not been paid a commission. As we enter Charlotte Square, I look around to see a superb model of perfect Georgian architecture with symmetry, elegance and a beauty that has existed for almost 200 years. I look upon this square as being the jewel in the crown of the New Town, and it's considered to be one of the finest squares in Europe, with the added compliment of being recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The designer of the surrounding buildings was Robert Adam, who took many of his ideas from his grand tour of Italy in the 1750s. On entry to the square, you first notice the large bronze statue on a horse and a sizable stone plinth with 4 figures at each corner in the centre of the green. This is a monument to Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria. He died at the young age of 42. They'd been married for 21 years and had 9 children. It was unveiled by the mourning Queen in 1876, after which she retired to Balmoral, where, for the first 3 years, she refused to appear in public, becoming known as the Widow of Windsor. She wore only black for the rest of her reign, which lasted nearly 64 years. It's believed that the person to bring her out of her mourning was a Highlander who worked at Balmoral called John Brown. There was a slightly controversial British film about the relationship Brown had with Queen Victoria called Mrs. Brown, and that was released in 1997. And if you haven't seen it, it is well worth a look. And as an aside, John Brown was a caring and loyal servant to the Queen, but there's no suggestion of impropriety. The garden in which the statue sits is private and available only to owners of the surrounding properties, similar to the gardens facing Queen Street properties. In August each year, it does open for 3 weeks for the Edinburgh International Book Festival, which is an impressive gathering of literature talent from all over the world. So if you're in Edinburgh during the festival, take your book along and have it signed by one of the famous authors. The other immediate feature on the other side of the square is the impressive building opposite George Street, which was originally St George's Church. It's now the West Register House, which houses the National Records of Scotland. Its purpose is to collect, preserve and produce information about Scotland's people and history, and it's available to all who wish to access it. They hold records spanning from the 12th to the 21st centuries, touching on virtually every aspect of Scottish life, including public and legal records. Wherever you are in the world, you can access their records online, and of course, if you come to Scotland, you might wish to visit as part of your genealogical research. The square is a one-way system, so driving around clockwise, the south side of the square has some interesting properties. Number 16 is the birthplace of Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, the inventor of the telephone. He was actually in Boston in the USA at the time and created the amazing piece of equipment that has changed all our lives, while he was attempting to create a hearing aid for his wife. Can you just imagine if it was the other way around, and Mrs. Bell was trying to create a hearing aid for Alexander? As you all know, after a certain number of years of marriage, men tend to tune out of the wife's frequency, so if she'd designed it for him, it might never have caught on. Number 24 Charlotte Square was the home of General Haig, the Supreme British Army commander during the First World War. He was a slightly controversial figure who was said to have fought a 20th century war with 19th century tactics, and sadly hundreds of thousands of troops died in the trenches in France against the Germans, but his main saving grace is that we won. On the north side are 11 houses behind what looks like a palace frontage. This was considered to be Robert Adams' finest work, and the residents reflected their newfound status. At number 9 lived Lord Lister. He was the one that pioneered the antiseptic. Numbers 6, 7 and 8 were acquired by the 4th Marquess of Bute in 1922, but in lieu of death duties in 1966, the houses were handed over to the National Trust for Scotland and remain in their care today. Number 6 is now the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland, and Number 7 has been restored to its original and is open to the public to visit a genuine Georgian house. The houses are built in yellow sandstone, and if you take a close look at how they've been built, you will see that below street level, the servants' quarters, the stone looks rough, whereas above street level, it's a smooth texture. This was deliberate to make it look as if the houses were built on solid rock, almost copying the castle that's built on the solid rock of a volcanic plug. The other features to look out for are the metal boot scrapers by the door, and just at the steps leading up to the door, you have the street lights, and they would have been lit by oil originally, then gas, before electricity was introduced. And at the bottom of each light is a cone-shaped piece of metal called a link horn, and that's used to extinguish the oil light. And it's just super to see so much has been preserved. So, we are about to visit the house, and we're standing in Charlotte Square on a wide pavement looking at Number 7. In front of us is a beautifully constructed yellow sandstone building in dressed ashlar, 3 stories high, and a cellar underneath a walkway leading up to the blue front door. The windows in the first 2 floors are tall, around 6 feet high, while the top windows are almost half the height, and this is an architectural trick to make the buildings look taller than they really are. Well, we climb up the 5 stone steps, passing the elegant metal lamp standards either side of the stairs, and walk around 15 feet to the front door. Above the door is a beautifully crescent-shaped transom window, the width of the door, and we're met by one of the National Trust volunteers who ushers us in to the inner hall. On the ground floor we find the dining room and, surprisingly, a bedroom. There's a basement, but we ascend to the first floor where we'd find the parlour and the drawing room. On the second floor we'd find the exhibition rooms, but these would have been bedrooms, and above, on the attic floor, would have been more bedrooms and a nursery. Luckily, I bump into Sarah Garfitt, one of the volunteers, in the parlour, and I ask her to give me some thoughts and insights into the house.
Hi, I'm Sarah and I am a volunteer at the Georgian house on Charlotte Square in Edinburgh. And we are currently in the parlour, which is on the first floor of the Georgian house. And this is very much where the family would have spent time together. So you would have had afternoon tea, you would have done your reading. If there were young kids, when they were spending time with their parents, they would have come down and done that with their parents in this room, and you could have played chess, learned your letters, done your practicing of how to keep house if you were a girl. But one of the interesting things about this is very much the first floor was an entertaining space. So you will also find on this floor the drawing room, and if they were having a party they could have all the doors open so that the guests could circulate across the whole floor. And in this room you'd probably find people playing cards or doing other things as the dancing was happening in the drawing room. So if you didn't want to dance, you were quite possibly in here with other people.
Great stuff. And as far as entertaining was concerned, that's the main ballroom. Where is that situated in the house?
So that's the drawing room, and that would always be on the first floor, because then you could have it the width of the whole house. So if you think about a townhouse, as you come in your reception space and vestibule, you can't put entertaining space in that space, so you would have it on the first floor, because then you're a wee bit further away from the smells of the city as you've got the horses and everything going past, and you also then have the width there, so everybody would go into there and do your dancing in there, and that room would be very much kind of only used for entertainment or dance lessons, so you wouldn't be going in there to just relax as a family. That would be very much done in the parlour.
Lovely. And upstairs, the main bedroom area, I take it?
Interestingly, actually, the main bedroom is on the ground floor, because that was an Edinburgh custom up until about 1820. The bedroom was also not how we think of it, as kind of a really private room. You know, the lady of the house would receive visitors in there in the morning. Your bed is actually one of your most expensive things in the house, so you want to show it off. The ladies, before you would go in for a meal, would probably check their hair, check their faces and all that sort of stuff that we ladies like to do. So it's not a private room in the way we think of it. Yeah. And so it does definitely catch a few people off guard, because you don't expect the bedroom to be next to the dining room on the ground floor.
Thank you very much indeed. That was excellent.
And thank you again to Sarah for taking the time to give us a wee insight into the wonderful Georgian house. As it happens, I already had arranged for a telephone interview with the manager of the Georgian house, Shiona Martin, for a more detailed discussion, and I'm delighted that we can meet her now. Hello, Shiona.
Hello there. Hi, John. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Could you just introduce yourself for the listeners?
Yeah, so I am Shiona Martin, and I'm the Visitor Services Manager at the Georgian House.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast, Shiona, just to give us a feeling of who lived in the Georgian house.
Well, our first owner was a landowner called John Lamont. He was also the 18th chief of the clan Lamont. Well, he paid for number 7, as the Georgian house was then called, to be built in 1796. And he lived here with his wife Helen and their 5 children for between 1796 and eventually moved out in 1815. The children all grew up, of course, and then got married from the house, and it was just left with John and his wife Helen living in the house. They might have had, we would say, 6 or 7 servants. So a butler, who would have been a general manservant. Then they would have had a cook. Your reputation as good hosts at this time depended on the quality of food that your cook produced. So you would always say that the cook was worth her weight in gold, I think.
Yeah.
A couple of housemaids to do all the general cleaning and the fetching and carrying for the family. And then a young kitchen maid who could be as young as 10, imagine that, as young as 10,
wow, working
in the kitchen alongside the cook 16 hours a day for 6.5 days a week, maybe 7 days a week, depending on the needs for the family. So it's just mind-boggling that they're working over 100 hours a week in the house. And the young girl is, at 10 or 11. The housemaids could be 12 or 13, so
yes,
not that old either.
Yes. It sort of brings the programme Downton Abbey into perspective, doesn't it?
It does indeed, absolutely.
So this is real life.
This is real life. And the younger servants are sent into service because their wages then go home to the family,
of course,
to help look after their younger siblings, to put food on the table.
Yes.
They might have stayed in the house but if their family lived up in the old town, they would probably have gone home in the evening. Imagine doing that in the winter.
I know.
When it's pitch dark.
Well,
and no street light.
Yeah, interesting enough, my last podcast was on the old town, and I talked about the awful conditions living in that particular part of town. And one of the reasons, of course, most of the rich actually moved from the old town down to the new town. In fact, just thinking about Charlotte Square itself, who would be their neighbours, do you think?
We know at number 6, Sir John Sinclair, who had his estates up in Sutherland and Caithness, somewhere like that. He lived at number 6 for a short time, and he was the person that brought together the first statistical account for Scotland in 1797. You had Sir William Fettes, who left his money for the founding of Fettes College. His only son died before he did, so George Combe lived in another area of Charlotte Square at this time, and he was very up with the Phrenological Society in Scotland, and he studied the skulls of Robert Burns, for example, and the murderer, William Burke. He lived in Charlotte Square, so it's a nice connection.
Oh, nice.
And some of the later people that were in Charlotte Square, Joseph Lister.
Yeah, Joseph Lister, yeah.
Lister, I think he lived at number 9, and you've got Alexander Graham Bell at the other side of the square.
The inventor of telephone, yeah.
Invented the telephone, absolutely, and there'll be loads of others, but these are the few that I
Well, no, thank you. Well, do you know, it's just fascinating to see the sort of people that are living there at the time. Can you give me an idea as the sort of daily routine for the family in the house?
If you go for a sort of traditional man, he would then go out to work if he was a lawyer or a doctor or... I don't know about John Lamont. I'm sure he had business dealings. He must have met with clients and that sort of thing. But he was a landowner, a city gentleman. His wife, Helen, would have discussed the menus with the cook, possibly liaised with the housekeeper, especially if they were having a dinner party and then a dance. She might have had guests in, the lady guests come to see her in the morning. They would have used her bedchamber, which is on the ground floor, as a morning room. But in the afternoon, it was part of the sort of social custom of the time that the lady of the house would send out invitations for ladies to come and take tea. But it would be the lady of the house who would make the tea and serve it to her guests. It was partly her showing off,
yes,
because tea is very expensive in this period.
yes.
The boys of the family would have been sent to school, the Royal High School around at the time. The girls would have been educated at home, or they would have had a governess who would come in.
Of course,
Also,
and I suppose the social side was very important for the young girls,
absolutely.
because when they were educated or became young women and therefore eligible for marriage, it would
They had to be marriageable.
They had to be marriageable. So, and am I right in thinking they had to have a chaperone if they did go out?
Indeed, absolutely. And if they were under 30 and not married, they had to be chaperoned when they went out, and they weren't allowed to go out on their own, which seems strange to us today, doesn't it?
It does.
How things have changed.
Yeah.
But as soon as they got married, they were expected to go with their husband.
Sorry, how did they find a husband if they're
Well, I think there was a little bit of matchmaking went on between Mrs. Lamont and, her equivalent in another family, and you would have people here in the evening. So part of the evening routine would be having groups for small dinner parties, and then dancing up in the drawing room. And then the musical instruments like the square piano, the flute, would be getting played by either members of the family. And that could be gents as well as ladies, or the young girls as well as the young boys. And maybe somebody playing a violin as well, because you have to create your own music for the dances.
Yeah, of course.
But you could also go to the assembly rooms, which were, we've come past that in your podcast.
Yes, I do indeed.
Already.
I have done, yeah.
1787, the assembly rooms opened, and you go to big balls there. So you learn the dances and perform them from a dance master, and learn them in your own home.
I then went on to ask Shiona if, apart from the Lamonts, there were any particularly interesting families who stayed at number 7.
I suppose we could say the fourth owners were the Reverend Alexander White and his wife Jane, and they were a power couple from the late Victorian, early Edwardian period, and very involved in social reforming within the city, particularly Jane. But she was also very interested in, despite the fact that her husband was a free church minister, she was very interested in other faiths. Mm-hmm. And in 1906, she went to Palestine and met Abdu'l-Baha, who was the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith. And in January 1913, Abdu'l-Baha stayed with the Whites for four or five nights in January 1913, when he was on a lecture tour of Great Britain, and this was his time in Edinburgh.
Wow.
And
so he stayed at number 7.
He stayed at number 7, so we are a place of pilgrimage for the Baha'i faith, and we get many members of the Baha'i faith come purely to see the little plaque that we've got commemorating that, and just to be in the same house that Abdu'l-Baha had been in. So it's actually something that's really unusual.
Yeah, that's lovely, actually, yes.
And it shows that the house had a history beyond the Lamont family or Catherine Farquharson, the second owner. It then went on to Charles Neaves, who apparently met Charles Dickens. So there we go. And he was a High Court judge and a wealthy High Court judge. And then on to the White family, who hosted Abdu'l-Baha. So it's lovely.
Yeah. And of course, then sadly, the house clearly takes a downturn, as everything does. And just tell me how that happened and how the National Trust got involved in taking over.
Well, how did the National Trust get it? Well, when the Whites moved out, they sold it to the 4th Marquess of Bute. And the 4th Marquess of Bute already owned number 5 and number 6, so he then bought number 7. So he purchased the whole central pediment of a palace front designed by Robert Adams. So he then handed them on to the 5th Marquess of Bute. And then when the 5th Marquess died in 1957, the National Land Fund procedures kicked in. Mm-hmm. During his lifetime, the 5th Marquess had been speaking with the Treasury and the National Trust for Scotland, so it was already set in train when he was alive that 5, 6 and 7 would all be handed over in lieu of death duties to the National Trust for Scotland. Mm-hmm. And number 5 became the headquarters of the National Trust for Scotland, and it will be again very shortly. Number 6 was the official residence for the Secretary of State for Scotland, now the First Minister's official residence, since the Parliament reconvened in 1999. And number 7 was always envisaged to be restored on 3 of the 5 floors, which is what we've still got as a typical late 18th, early 19th century Edinburgh townhouse, decorated and furnished and equipped as it could have looked when John Lamont lived here with his family. The 4th Marquess of Bute was instrumental around 1930, 1931 in using his clout, shall we say, and having a preservation order placed on Charlotte Square, so that you couldn't have the same fate as St Andrew's Square. Charlotte Square was a conservation area by then, and people had to be careful what they did to any of the buildings. So
hallelujah for that.
Well, exactly, and we've a lot to thank the 4th Marquess for in making sure that happened.
Yeah, and even as I come down George Street, we've just been to St Andrew's Square, and it's such a stark difference when you get to the far end and go into Charlotte Square. It's just like a different world, and yet a lovely world, having been preserved.
Yeah, absolutely. It is.
Just one final question. How long have you worked for the National Trust, and what would you say was their main aim in preserving all these wonderful buildings?
Well, I've worked for the National Trust for Scotland for 26 years, believe it or not.
Wow.
I came originally to be a volunteer in the Georgian House, and then I was taken on as a part-time seasonal staff member, and guess what? I've not left yet. I'm still here. But I suppose the whole purpose of the National Trust for Scotland is to preserve and look after Scotland's heritage. And it's not just built heritage like our lovely building. You do have your castles and houses, but you've also got 35 major gardens and estates, 75,000 hectares of countryside, and 46 of the Munros, the highest mountains in Scotland, within the care of the National Trust for Scotland. Places like Bannockburn, Culloden, also in their care, and trying to think some of the industrial heritage, Preston Mill, Barry Mill. You've got the wonderful Robert Smale's print works down in Innerleithen.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's extraordinary.
The scope of what they care for is just mind-boggling.
Well, I'm delighted I've renewed my National Trust for Scotland membership, and I'll be visiting many of those properties.
Yeah, well, absolutely, yes. Without the income coming from membership, it's the largest income source for the National Trust, for the Trust, and it's a reliable income source. About 330,000 members, and they're hoping to grow that so that they can then continue to care for the properties. And their job is to preserve the heritage and make it accessible. That's the other key thing, is to make it accessible and make everyone feel welcome in it.
Well, I have to say I can endorse everything you've said, and I've visited many of these properties as a Blue Badge guide, but I've also taken out membership myself because it is just such a worthy cause, and you do an absolutely cracking job. And I have to say the Georgian House is an absolute wonder and very much worth popping in to have a look and a good tour around. And can I say, you mentioned about the staff. The staff that I met the day I was in the other day, absolutely wonderful, really welcoming, knowledgeable, and so thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. We have a very, very small staff team of by this time next week, 7 members of staff, but about 150 volunteers.
Wow.
And most of whom are guides for showing the visitors around, but we have retail assistants so that we can put more of the profits back into maintaining the house. And we've got some flower arrangers who start back at the end of March as well and do the flowers for us. We've got meters and greeters on the front door to welcome visitors and say goodbye to them. They do that in costumes, so just to give an added extra.
Yeah.
So, without volunteers and without the staff, we don't open the doors, of
No.
course.
Well, in fact, as it happens, before I left, I was in the parlour and met Sarah Garfett, one of your volunteers, lovely lady.
Of course.
And Sarah was kind enough to say a few words for me, so we'll hear her on the podcast at some stage as well.
Good, yeah.
Nice lass.
Sarah's one of our younger volunteers who's still working, and she comes in once or twice a month and does a shift. She's been volunteering with us for over 10 years now.
Amazing.
So it's brilliant. Yeah.
Well, she I think she represents and exemplifies what it is the volunteer service do for the National Trust. Well, Shona,
absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute wonder zooming around with you on this particular podcast. Listen, thank you very much indeed for taking the time out to give me a call and to come on the podcast and for telling us all about the lovely Georgian house.
No, you're very welcome, and please come and visit us. It's a wonderful home.
Yeah, I can confirm that, folks. You've just got to go and visit the Georgian house when you're in Charlotte Square in Edinburgh. Well, thank you again to Shiona and Sarah for your insights, and if you are in Edinburgh, this gem of a Georgian house is not to be missed. I have to say the staff and volunteers that I met were all very keen to help and will give you much more information as you tour the house. And if you do see Shiona or Sarah when you visit the Georgian house, then let them know that you heard them on the Unique Scotland podcast. It's like meeting old friends. And a final shout out to the National Trust for Scotland, who care and look after so much of our heritage. And I can't recommend strongly enough that you sign up as a member to enjoy all the amazing benefits that membership offers. Well, as we leave Charlotte Square, we head north, down the slope from George Street and descend onto Queen Street, with impressive Georgian townhouses all along the row. One striking building is at number 8, the Royal College of Physicians, with statues at the front of Asclepius, Hygeia and Hippocrates, with entwined pillars with serpents, the traditional sign of the physician. Number 52 Queen Street was the home of Sir James Young Simpson, pioneer of the anaesthetic, in other words, chloroform, which he introduced for women giving birth, and he used it on Queen Victoria and, having tried it with success, made it popular with new mothers. Now looking to the north from Queen Street, you have the private enclosed gardens that I talked about, and beyond the second New Town, and it's very pleasing to see that the city fathers, on selling land for further building, demanded that the new houses should be built in a similar fashion to the original New Town, so Georgian-styled houses built in white sandstone gives the whole area of an elegant look. And just the other side of these gardens is a street called Heriot Row, and this is where Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous Scottish writer, was brought up. And his house was really part of the second New Town. And it's wonderful to see the Georgian-style neoclassical architecture extended north. Now, I've talked about neoclassicism, which is architecture that draws on Roman and Greek architecture, and this phase was at its height from the 18th to 19th century. And it came to Edinburgh from architects such as Robert Adam and Henry Playfair, both of whom learned their trades while on grand tours of Europe. Robert's first grand tour was to Rome and Greece from 1755 to 1757, where he would have met many of the leading artists and architects of Europe, such as Clereceau, Piranesi, Mengs, and of course the very famous Scottish artist Alan Ramsay, who was on his own grand tour as it happens, and he was on honeymoon with his new wife Anne Bain. So you can see where the Roman and Greek influence comes from in Edinburgh architecture of the late 18th and early 19th century, and why Edinburgh is often called the Athens of the North. If we now head south, back over George Street and down Hanover Street, we come down onto Princes Street. Well, go straight ahead at the lights. The road actually bends round to the right and quickly back to the left, with a steep incline taking us back up into the Old Town. This is the Mound, or the mound of rubble deposited here when building the New Town, showing you how the two towns are now connected. Princes Street Gardens are to the left and right, but immediately to the left we find the extraordinary classical Greek buildings making up the Royal Scottish Academy and the National Galleries of Scotland. They were designed by another famous Scottish architect, William Henry Playfair, who designed them in a neoclassical style. They were opened to the public in 1859, and the National Gallery houses Scotland's national collection of fine art from the beginning of the Renaissance up to the start of the 20th century. The Royal Scottish Academy is the country's national academy of art, promoting contemporary Scottish art. And it's at this point on the Mound that we leave the New Town behind, and it's an appropriate point to end the tour of the New Town. So I hope this overview has whet your appetite for a more comprehensive look by visiting the city yourselves. Of course, the city has also grown well beyond the walls of the old and the new towns, with much more to see and experience, but I hope this short tour has given you a good insight as to how Edinburgh ticks. And of course, if you want a private tour of the city, then do go to my website and fill in the contact form. I have to say, Edinburgh is probably one of my favourite cities in the world. It's not too big, it's a university town, and has a fabulous focal point with a castle towering above the city. As I mentioned, I was brought up in a small village about 10 miles south of the city, and almost every weekend I would travel into town on the bus and go swimming with some of my school friends at the swimming pool in Bath Street. When we finished, we'd get some fish and chips, then head into the Museum of Scotland and spend a few hours walking around the incredible exhibitions and artefacts from around the world. Even today, I still get a kick out of walking the museum's floors, and now there's a new museum as well attached, focusing on Scotland itself. It's an amazing city, and I know that you will love it like a local once you've been. Well, folks, that is the end of this tour of Edinburgh's New Town, and I hope you've enjoyed both podcasts, old and new, simply meandering around the streets of this fine city with me. I was in Edinburgh last week to take some up-to-date photographs, so do have a look on my Facebook page and website to see those. To ensure you get notification of all my Unique Scotland podcasts, please go to my website, Exclusive Scottish Visits, on the podcast page and click on the email subscribe button to register. Or you may be listening to Unique Scotland on one of the many podcast channels such as Apple, Spotify, or even YouTube. In any case, don't forget to subscribe to hear much more of this amazing country. And I'd like to give a shout out to Trevetta Johnson. And Trevetta couldn't find episode 5 of my North Coast 500 on the website. Well, there was a fault clicking through and it always went to episode 6. I'd like to say, Trevetta, it's now fixed. So if you want to listen to episode 5 of the North Coast 500 on my website, just click on 5 and it will come up. So thank you for letting me know. Trevetta and her husband David come from Knoxville, Tennessee, near the Appalachian Mountains. And I'm pleased to hear that they're coming on holiday to Scotland in August, and I've been following my podcast to help plan their trip. Well, guys, have a fabulous time in Scotland, and if possible, we might meet up. As always, I have thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you. I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of the areas we visited today or any other podcast that you've listened to, or if you wish me to cover any aspect of Scottish life, then please get in touch through the contact page on my website or send an email to info@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. The next podcast is a closer look into the formidable bastion on top of the extinct volcano, Edinburgh Castle. You'll hear about the Half Moon Battery built in the 1500s, the Argyll battery of guns to defend against the Jacobites, the 1 o'clock gun and why is it fired every day to shake Edinburgh to its roots, the military prison and who were the inmates, and all that before we arrive at Crown Square with the Royal Palace, now housing the honours or Crown Jewels of Scotland, and they went missing for over 100 years. You'll also hear about the oldest building in Edinburgh and how it has survived the ravages of Robert the Bruce and modern-day building and demolition. This and much more awaits you. Well, I get a great deal of pleasure bringing you these podcasts, and I'm delighted to have met many of you who have listened to them. Some of you have come on tour with me, and others who cannot travel have sent lovely messages for support for allowing them to enjoy Scotland from their armchair at home. There's another group who have listened to my podcast, and they've come to Scotland under their own steam. They've decided to do their own thing and also try their hand at driving on the wrong side of the road. Well, I'd like to remind you that I do provide a bespoke itinerary service with personal backup, so get in touch if that interests you. Now check out my other podcasts on Loch Lomond or the Isle of Skye, or perhaps my latest series on the North Coast 500, and lots more. Well, it's been a great pleasure to have you all listening today, and I would now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising a glass to you wherever you are in the world. Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.